Hello guys, this time we are going to learn the fillet position. At the same time we are looking at the position with the checks from the rear and what happens if the rook is in front of the pawn at the edge of the board and how to avoid the skewer. Let's get into it. Let's have a look what happens if the rook is not defending our king from the back rank, but the rook will be attacking the king from the rear. This is another type of defense that we need to be familiar with. Therefore, let's have a look at a few positions. First, we have the situation that if white is to move, white checkmates in one move. Therefore, it is that threat that we need to recognize, but there is a black to move. Therefore, black throws the check, and take notice, the king cannot hide in front of the pawn. It's a super important element that we need to know, that the king cannot hide in front of the pawn. And now, after that, the king step back, we are throwing the check again, harassing the king all the time, as long as the king gets out from the zone and not protecting the pawn. After that, we'll be attacking the pawn from the rear, and the rook either goes closer and we are just attacking it twice, either if the king is far away from the pawn and the pawn moves forward, we capture, and after all of the exchanges takes place, we are just simply getting into the drawn position as all of the material is gone. Therefore, the first idea, throwing the checks from the rear if the pawn is on the h-file. Of course, this move draws as well, but we just have seen this one at the previous episode. Now let's have a look what happens if the pawn is not on h-file, but on g-file. Again, the pawn on the 6th rank, but this time on the g-file. And again, this time we could get into the back rank, and now this is the position that we just discussed the previous episode, but what happens if we can throw the checks and the king cannot hide in front of the pawn? And this is the idea. After throwing the checks from the rear, the king is trying to escape, but there is no space for that as the king cannot get in front of the pawn from any of the directions, and therefore the game ends in a draw. Of course, if you go into the back rank, we are just drawing as well, because the draw is with the pawns and h and g. With the pawn f, it would be a loss. For example, this is the perpetual repetition, and of course, if white would just push the pawn forward with this idea of making the skewer, after rook getting to the 6th rank, the king is forced to step back, and we just capture the rook, winning easily. What we have seen the previous episode. Therefore, the way throwing the checks from the rear, the main idea is not to allow the king to get the king in front of the pawn to have the shield. Another one, we just discussed the pawn with the h6, g6, now the pawn f6. And of course, again, the threat of checkmate in one. And now, if black gets into the back rank, we have this idea of check, and the pawn forward with the skewer, which we have seen the previous episode. But if black to move, black can just draw with the throwing checks from the rear. After throwing the check, again, the king cannot hide in front of the pawn. Therefore, we are harassing the king with all of the checks. If the king is far away from the pawn, we simply attack it. Of course, now if the pawn moves forward, it is protected once, attacked twice. We just capture, and if the king gets closer, we are harassing the king as much as possible from the rear, throwing the checks, never giving the chance for the king to make any improvement. Now, what happens if we just have the king in the corner? Because now this would be a little bit different. Previously, we have the king either in front of the pawn, either with the knight's distance on the left, on the right. But this time, we're having the king that is opposite with the diagonal to the direction of the pawn. After throwing the check, the king gets in front of the pawn and the position is winning. At this moment, we'll be not analyzing this, but at some point I'll just show you why this position is winning and how to win this position. At this moment, we start to understand the basic ones, and now, as you can see, after this one, the position will be winning. Now, another type of position. If the pawn is moving to the promotion, we have one very important and powerful method of defending against the promotion. Now, if the rook is cutting off the king, not reaching any of the squares in front of the pawn on the 6th rank, and if the pawn hasn't crossed the 5th rank, we are just cutting off the king. And now, how the game could continue. We are just going back and forth over the 6th rank, of course, except dropping the piece onto the squares that is going to be captured either by the king, pawn, or the rook. And now, after that, if we're just repeating the position with moving back and forth with the rook on the 7th, cutting out our king from getting closer, we are just repeating the move on the 6th. Of course, if white tries to make more active actions like attacking the king, we are getting in front of the pawn. Take notice, if we are always in front of the pawn cannot attack the king even moving forward, because the pawn doesn't attack in the way that we can see. The pawn can only attack diagonally, therefore if the king is sitting in the same file as the pawn can never attack the king. Very important distinction. And now, after throwing the check, we are going back and forth, therefore this method of white trying to improve the position leads nowhere. And after moving the pawn forward, finally, we just cut off the 6th rank by the rook. The king couldn't move any closer, and now we are bringing the rook that will be going with the throwing the checks from the rear, and this guarantees us the draw. Why? Because we just seen it previous positions, and that's why I just want you to see it how it is done. Therefore, cutting off the king on the 6th rank, unless the pawn advance. If the pawn advance, we are bringing the rook from the rear as far as possible from the king and harassing the king. The king cannot hide anywhere. Another position, this time it was, previously it was with the pawn on the g5, now the pawn on the f5. It doesn't change anything, the method works for all of the pawns. Now, after the rooks is trying to go back and forth with this idea, as we just mentioned, throwing the checks from the 8th or 7th rank, the king goes up and down at the same file as the pawn. And now after that, if the pawn moves forward, the rook cut off the access for the king, therefore the king cannot get the shelter next to the pawn, and now we are moving the rook into the bottom of the board and throwing the checks every time the king is next to the pawn. After the king leaves the pawn, we can either harass the king, either attack the pawn. And now, after attacking the pawn, if the king doesn't protect it, we just capture. If the king protects it, we are harassing the king as long as the king is stepping away from protection of the pawn, and then we are just either harassing the king, either attacking the pawn. It's up to us, but all the time we need to harass the king if the king is in the left or right side of the pawn, otherwise it's going to be the checkmate in 1. And now the last part for today's episode, very simple example but very powerful from one of the easiest positions that I selected for you to understand. If the rook is in front of the pawn and the rook is in the corner, the pawn is on the edge of the board, there are two ways of winning the position. The first way is to throwing the check, and after throwing the check we can say that white buys the time, and when the pawn promotes, the pawn is promoted into the queen protecting the rook and rook protecting the new promoted queen. For example, after throwing the check, take notice black doesn't have the time to capture the pawn as the king is in check. After the king step back, now the pawn is promoted and the rook is protected. Take notice that rook is protected by the queen and queen is protected by the rook. After the capture, of course, the position is winning. Therefore, the first idea. Another idea how to make it work is the idea related to the skewer. And now, take notice, the idea is the following. If we step back with the rook as far as possible, after that we promote the pawn. Of course, after moving as far as possible from the king, you can say, wait a second, the pawn can be captured by the rook, isn't it? Yes. But if the pawn is captured, the distance between the king and the rook is too far away, and therefore we are just using so-called X-ray or the skewer attack. After the king step back, the king is not protecting the rook and they are losing the rook. Of course, if they do anything, for example, going left or right, we just promote the pawn, and after that we are just having new promoted queen. Black is forced to capture, it's winning anyway. Therefore, at this moment, the second idea, trying to exploit the X-ray attack on the 8th and 7th ranks. And now, you can see that this way works if white would play like that on the g8 square check, because the king cannot capture the rook. At the same time, white buys the time to promote the pawn. But what happens if the king gets into the square, that after throwing the check we just capture the rook, and of course the square of the promotion is still covered by the black rook. At this moment, there are two ways to make a defense successfully from black's perspective, either getting to g7 or h7. Why is that? Because we just stop both of the ideas with the X-ray attack or skewer attack from these squares, and that's why it is successful. And now what would be the defense? The defense is the following. We can go back and forth over these two squares. If the king touches the rook is getting as far away as possible on this same rank, because we need to always protect the promoting square. And now after that we can get back and forth. Again, if the rook is attacked by the king is getting in the same file as far as possible. And super important, in a moment, if the king is touching the pawn, you must harass the king with the checks from the rear as much as possible. But take notice, if the rook is attacked by the king, the rook should go as far as possible from the king. And now at this moment, if the king is not touching the pawn, the rook must stay behind. Because, for example, if you just play any other move, let's say with the king, the rook could just make the sacrifice. After the capture, the new promoted queen cannot be captured by the rook, because rook is not protecting the promoting square. Therefore, always remember about protecting the promoting square. And if the king is touching the pawn, just harass the king with the checks from the rear. And after the king stay away from the pawn, just leave the rook behind the pawn. And now the last two examples. At this moment, as you probably remember, if the king goes into one of the squares g7 on h7, the game is drawn. There are another two squares that we need to remember. These two, and if you just make a little bit like a mirror, these are another two right here. Take notice, secret square is like that as well, but this is not so much into the main idea. Therefore, even if this is correct, but I am not analyzing this because it can confuse you in the later stages. Therefore, at this moment, the king gets into the square, attacking the rook, and for the second time attacking the pawn. If the rook tries to make the same trick, take notice we can capture either with the rook, either with the king, and after the exchange of the rook, the game finishes. And take notice, if the king went into the c7, it would be the same. Why? Because again, after the capture by the x-ray, the king will be able to step back protecting the rook. Let's have a look. After the king gets c7, the only way to make a draw at this position, except throwing the check just a little bit like buying the time, is this move. And now again, the same idea. The promoting of the pawn is the threat. And now at this moment, the king is going closer. After the king is going closer, there is another method for defense, therefore another one, but just basic one is this one. And after the capture, we have a draw. Of course, after the king gets closer right there, if the pawn promotes, we can just capture twice, therefore this is going to be successful as well. Therefore, in global, the king must go to c7, and after that, either we capture the pawn immediately, either getting the king to have double protection or double controlling of the square in the corner. And now at this moment, take notice, either the king step back onto the squares on the b file, the king protects the rook, therefore the game ends in a draw. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this Rook endgame series, and see you the next episode.